January 1959. In the village of Yakushintsi in the Vinnytsia region, a neighbor went into the yard of the Diachenko family in the morning. Nobody opened the door for her. The smell of burning hay made the woman go around the house. There she found the body of the owner, Victor Diachenko. A murder with a firearm in the late 50s was a rare crime. Only hunters were allowed to keep guns at home. All firearms were strictly registered. The neighbor had heard a gunshot the night before. She assumed that Victor was shooting at hares, even though hunting within the settlement's limits was prohibited. In the morning, she decided to scold him. The local patrol officer described the deceased as rough and argumentative. He could have quarreled with someone, leading to gunfire. He didn't know why the victim's wife wasn't home. She might have been scared and run away. An expert determined the shot was fired with buckshot, and half of the victim's skull was blown away. Detectives found a shell casing. Nearby lay a matchbox from the Mayak factory, with a picture of a woman in traditional Uzbek costume. Perhaps these matches were used to ignite the haystack. The matchbox intrigued the detectives. In the Soviet Union, dozens of factories produced matches sold regionally. However, the Mayak factory from the distant city of Rapist did not supply its products to the Vinnytsia region. A criminologist discovered nearby tire tracks from a motorcycle with a sidecar. The neighbor couldn't say if she heard a bike the previous day. By the house, another neighbor of the deceased awaited the investigator. As it turned out, he had witnessed the fire on the property. The man said he saw a haystack burning behind Victor's house the previous evening. He rushed to warn him, knocking until the owner opened the door. Victor rushed out of the house, cursing, and ran to put out the fire. On the way, he shouted to his wife, Lyudmila, to grab the gun. Once in the street, the neighbor heard a gunshot. The man assumed that Victor had fired a non-lethal shot with salt. He always had a few cartridges loaded with salt. It causes severe pain but isn't life-threatening. Victor used this method in the fall to deter boys who climbed into his garden for apples. No gun was found. Victor and Lyudmila had a rocky relationship. He frequently raised his hand to her, so she could have shot her husband, especially since she was the one to fetch the gun. A straightforward theory emerged: domestic conflict. The search began for Lyudmila. Another neighbor suggested that she might be hiding with her sister Valentina in the city of Vinnytsia. The detective found the sister and her husband at home. Valentina insisted Lyudmila hadn't arrived during the night. Victor's death was shocking news for the couple. The husband, Yuri, was his nephew. Victor had introduced them, so their familial ties were dual. They last visited 2 weeks ago and planned to visit this weekend but canceled because Yuri had a lupus flare-up, causing a facial rash. Both asserted that Lyudmila couldn't have killed her husband. It wasn't in her nature. Yuri recalled that suspicious men had visited Victor multiple times, bringing him money or taking it. Such individuals could have killed him and kidnapped Lyudmila to extort valuables. The investigators pondered the motorcycle and matches might not have had any relation to the tragic event. It was impossible to determine when the bike left its trace and how long the matches had been on the ground, but it could be assumed that the haystack was set on fire to lure the owner out of the house. The detectives' thoughts were interrupted by a phone call. The road patrol reported on the outskirts of the Voronovitsa settlement. A motorcycle with a sidecar was found overturned by the roadside. It was spotted by a passing truck driver. He stopped, approached the bike, and noticed a woman lying in the snow, alive but unconscious, with a large wound on her head. The driver pulled the injured woman into the truck's cabin and took her to the hospital. From there, he informed the authorities about the overturned motorcycle. The detective arrived at the hospital. He took Lyudmila's sister with him for identification, but wisely chose not to take her into the ward. The doctor said questioning the woman would be impossible. She had a severe head injury and hadn't regained consciousness. Regarding the nature of the injury, the doctor said it didn't seem as though it resulted from a vehicle accident. He observed no multiple bruises or fractures. It looked more like a single blow. Valentina immediately recognized her sister, Lyudmila. She was allowed to stay with her in the ward. Using the motorcycle's license plates, its owner was identified. The detective went to Sergei Ryabokon, a resident of the same village. Sergei revealed that he was about to report the motorcycle stolen. The man hadn't been home for a week. He was visiting relatives in Kiev. Upon returning, he saw that the lock on the garage door was broken. Sergei insisted that he even knew the thief's name. It was the local thug, Grigory Kozulko. He'd been caught stealing from local houses and barns several times. When the detective knocked on Grigory's door, no one answered, but the jars drying on the fence were still wet, implying they had been washed recently. Noise came from the house, and the detective decided to enter without an invitation. The homeowner jumped out of a window, but his escape attempt was unsuccessful. He was arrested and accused of resisting the police, stealing the motorcycle, and the violent attack on the Diachenko family. Stunned by these accusations, Grigory yelled that he had nothing to do with it. He had an alibi for the time of Victor Diachenko's murder. He was drinking beer with friends at his house and hadn't gone out. The detective noticed a collection of matchboxes in a cabinet. Among them was one identical to the one they found at Victor Diachenko's murder scene, a Mayak factory matchbox, with an image of a woman in a traditional Uzbek costume. It appeared that Grigory had carefully planned his crime, but impulsively took matches from his collection to set the haystack on fire. The man replied that the collection belonged to his brother Vasily, who cherished every box. Grigory wouldn't dare touch them. The detectives presented Grigory with a record of his previous detentions. It had everything from stealing rabbits from a neighbor to trying to steal a motorcycle. Yet none of the cases made it to court. All incidents were settled by his brother Vasily. In an old report, Grigory had claimed he could start a motorcycle without a key by directly connecting the wires. Still, he was caught by the motorcycle's owner before he could drive away. Detectives decided to meet with his brother Vasily, the owner of a matchbox collection. They found Vasily at home. He confirmed that the collection of boxes belonged to him. He hid it from his wife at his brother's house. She complained that he spent too much money on his hobby. The detectives inquired about the box with an Uzbek woman on it, and whether there was only one such box in the collection. Vasily explained that he had several of them. The matches were brought by an uncle who had visited them in Vinnytsia. Vasily added one box to his collection and took the rest to the canning factory where he worked. Some of his colleagues are also matchbox collectors. He exchanged with some and even gifted boxes to others. Vasily couldn't imagine any of his collector acquaintances shooting someone, and they certainly wouldn't set fire to a haystack with such rare matches. Only someone unfamiliar with their value would do that. Vasily remembered that he had to give his colleague one matchbox with this label. He left a box unattended on the workbench, and a mechanic took a match, struck it, and lit a cigarette. The match mark on the side devalues the box. The mechanic, realizing what he had done, apologized and promised to give an interesting specimen in return. The mechanic's name was Yuri. The detectives recalled a conversation with Valentina and her husband, Yuri. He mentioned working at the canning factory. They showed Vasily a photo, and he identified him as the mechanic. Vasily added that the guy knew his brother Grigory. He had introduced them. The detectives had a new theory. What if Yuri, the nephew of the murdered Victor Sidorchuk, was the killer? They remembered a neighbor's story. He said Victor ran out of the house, and his wife Lyudmila ran after him. The neighbor stepped out of his gate and heard a gunshot. It's 10 steps to the gate. He got there in no more than 30 seconds. Lyudmila simply wouldn't have had time to bring the gun in that amount of time. What if she hadn't got the gun? What if the weapon was already missing from the house by that time? Only a close person could have stolen it in advance. The nephew was a likely suspect. He was confronted with the suspicions. Too many facts pointed to his involvement in the crime. Yuri was nervous, and his defenses weren't persuasive. He had long run out of matches with the label of the girl in Uzbek costume. He threw the box in the trash. He didn't know about his uncle's gun. Yuri confessed he didn't get along well with Victor. Due to his lupus illness, the uncle treated him with disgust. He called him red-faced and avoided close contact. During the interrogation, news came. A possible murder weapon was found, wrapped in cloth, by a local resident in the woods. There's a high chance that fingerprints were preserved on it. The detective warned Yuri that he wouldn't have an opportunity for a sincere confession once the prints were identified. Left with no choice, the suspect confessed. He killed his uncle, Victor Diachenko. The motive for the murder seemed odd. Victor insulted and humiliated him because of his disease. He shamed him in front of people, emphasizing disgust at the rash on his face. The motivation for committing such a crime seemed insufficient. Nevertheless, Yuri elaborately explained how he had stolen the gun in advance and set the hay on fire. That's how he lured Victor out. He said that right after the shot, he ran into the woods, discarded the gun, and hitchhiked back to Vinnytsia. He said he knew nothing about the motorcycle and hadn't seen Lyudmila, his wife's sister. Unexpectedly, a message came from the hospital. The murdered man's wife, Lyudmila, had regained consciousness. In the room next to Lyudmila was her sister, Valentina. She was crying and ardently speaking to the wounded woman. But as soon as the detective appeared, she fell silent. They asked her to leave. A candid conversation with the victim was unsuccessful. Lyudmila said she couldn't remember anything and wasn't ready to continue the conversation. She complained of a terrible headache. The detective hoped that Valentina, the sister, would clarify the situation. He immediately informed her that her husband had been arrested and had confessed to murdering his uncle. Valentina pretended to know nothing about it, but her behavior suggested otherwise. The detective called her an accomplice to the murder and accused her of an attempt on her sister's life. Valentina fainted. Upon examining the unconscious woman, the doctor suspected she might be pregnant. When Valentina came to her senses, she immediately said her sister was never in danger. She and her husband had left her by the roadside so that the driver of the first car would notice her and take her to the hospital. The missing link now was the stolen motorcycle. During a subsequent interrogation, Grigory swore he knew nothing about the planned murder. Simply, Yuri had paid him to steal the neighbor's motorcycle. He asked for it, just for one night, promising to return it in the morning. Grigory intended to keep it in the garage so that the motorcycle owner wouldn't suspect a thing. But in the morning, Yuri didn't return the motorcycle. He explained that it broke down and had to be left on the road. Grigory was ready to face punishment for vehicle theft, but not for murder. The detective presented Valentina with the results of the fingerprint examination. On the gun were Yuri's prints, but clearly, on the barrel and the trigger, were the fingerprints of Valentina herself. It seemed Yuri tried to take the blame, but it was clear that it was Valentina who had shot Victor. The woman didn't deny it and began to testify. Everything began on the day when she came to her sister's house, but didn't find her there. Victor said that Lyudmila had gone to the district center's market to trade, would spend the night in a hostel for collective farmers, sell everything in the morning, and then return. Victor suggested that Valentina have a drink in celebration of their meeting. After a few shots, Victor assaulted her. Valentina tried to fight him off, but this only enraged him further. The weaker woman fell victim to his violence. Valentina did not report Victor because she was scared. She would be the subject of gossip and did not know how she would face her sister. A month later, she visited again. Victor's nephew happened to be there. Valentina confessed that she was pregnant and didn't know what to do. Victor introduced her to his nephew, Yuri, whom she grew fond of, and he moved in with her. Yuri found a job at a canning factory. They decided to marry. Valentina told Yuri that she was pregnant when she was in her 9th week. Yuri was delighted and began making plans. Valentina then realized she could not live in deceit and did not want to. She decided to tell Yuri everything. The truth stunned him. Valentina said that for the sake of their relationship, she was ready to see a doctor who would perform an illegal abortion for her. Yuri was against this. Valentina then confessed that she wanted to avenge Victor. His death would be retribution for his crime and would free her sister from a tyrannical and deceitful husband. Yuri had his own reasons for revenge. Uncle Victor had evicted him and his mother from home, demanded absolute obedience, and enjoyed the fear he instilled in others. Yuri stole Victor's gun 2 weeks before the murder. Victor only hunted in the summer, so he didn't notice its disappearance. Yuri wanted to shoot the oppressor himself, but Valentina insisted on doing it. She wanted to see the fear in his eyes before he died. The two of them set fire to a haystack and waited for Victor. Valentina pointed a gun at him. Victor begged her not to shoot, apologized, and was ready to kneel. But Valentina fired. She vented her anger on the already dead Victor. Yuri pulled her away and told her to run to the motorcycle. Then Lyudmila appeared on the path. She saw Yuri with a gun next to her dead husband. Yuri knocked her out with the butt of the gun and carried her to the motorcycle. They hoped the sister would regain consciousness and listen to their explanations, but the blow was too strong. Lyudmila did not regain consciousness. They couldn't take Lyudmila to the hospital. They would immediately expose themselves. They took her to their home. Only by the morning of the next day did they stage an accident. They placed Lyudmila near the road in a visible place. They waited until someone picked her up. Detectives were stunned. It turns out, during their visit to Valentina and Yuri's apartment, Lyudmila was unconscious in the next room. The court sentenced Valentina to 10 years of imprisonment. Yuri received 9 years. In prison, Valentina gave birth to a daughter. While the woman was serving her sentence, her sister took care of the child.